The screen opens with a wide shot of an enormous mansion, its windows glowing faintly against the inky blackness of a snowstorm. The camera slowly zooms in through frosted glass, revealing a lavish dining room where a single man, Victor Montero, sits at the head of a long, empty table. A golden chandelier casts a cold, artificial light over a feast meant for dozens, but no one else is present. Victor, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stares blankly at his untouched plate. The sound of a clock ticking grows louder as he grips a wine glass, his knuckles whitening. Suddenly, a gust of wind blows open the massive front doors, and a single piece of paper, torn and weathered, flutters into the room. The camera pans to the paper as it lands at Victor's feet, revealing the ominous words, "Your reckoning begins tonight." Victor Montero was the kind of man people envied, at least from a distance. Wealth beyond imagination, a sprawling empire that stretched across industries. A life that seemed untouchable, but as the snowstorm howled outside and shadows crept across his opulent mansion, the truth was clear. He was alone. Not just physically, but in a way that gnawed at his soul, though he'd never admit it. This Christmas Eve was no different from the others he had spent in recent years. He had dismissed his staff early in the evening, barking orders for them to go enjoy their insignificant little celebrations. The only sound that remained in the mansion was the echo of his polished shoes against marble floors as he paced through room after room, checking his collection of rare artifacts. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavier, colder. He could almost swear the shadows moved on their own. A small tremor of unease crawled up his spine, but Victor was not a man to entertain irrational thoughts. He dismissed the sensation with a scoff and poured himself another glass of wine. As he settled into his armchair by the fireplace, he allowed himself a moment of reflection, not on his life, of course, but on the empire he had built. "They all think they can survive without me," he muttered, referring to his former business partners and employees who had dared to leave or question him. Ungrateful parasites. Victor's thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang. He shot up, heart racing, as the sound echoed through the house. It came from the grand foyer. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, his voice trembling ever so slightly. He grabbed a nearby fireplace poker, its ornate handle cold and heavy in his grip, and approached the sound cautiously. The massive front doors stood ajar, snowflakes swirling into the room. He tightened his robe against the chill, his eyes darting around the empty space. As he moved to close the doors, something caught his eye. A piece of paper lying on the floor, its edges tattered as if it had traveled a great distance. Victor bent down and picked it up. The words scrawled across the page made his blood run cold. "Your reckoning begins tonight." The wind slammed the doors shut with a deafening crash, and the lights flickered. Victor turned, his heart pounding as he called out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed through the vast, empty halls. No answer. For the first time in years, Victor felt the sting of fear. He clutched the poker tighter, his knuckles white. The clock in the hall chimed midnight, and with each chime, the mansion seemed to grow darker. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision, but when he turned, nothing was there. "Pull yourself together, Victor," he muttered, retreating to his study and locking the door behind him. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He called his assistant, dialing the number with shaking fingers, straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he tried calling the local authorities, but the storm had knocked out the lines. Even his state-of-the-art security system seemed to be malfunctioning. Victor sat at his desk, the ominous note still clutched in his hand. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, some disgruntled former employee trying to rattle him. But deep down, he knew this was something more. as he stared into the flickering flames of his fireplace. A faint voice echoed through the room, soft but unmistakable. "You can't escape the past, Victor." He froze. "Who said that?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the flames in the fireplace roared higher, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. One shadow, taller and darker than the rest, seemed to step forward. Victor backed away, his bravado crumbling. "Show yourself," he demanded, though his voice quivered. The shadow stopped just short of him, and in a voice that was both chilling and familiar, it whispered, "It's time to see who you truly are." The room plunged into darkness. Victor Montero sat frozen in his study, staring into the darkened fireplace. The ominous note still rested in his trembling hands, its worn edges almost burning his skin with an unexplainable weight. He tried to shake off the unease, whispering to himself that this had to be some elaborate prank, yet the silence of the mansion, eerily heavy, like a crypt, mocked his attempts at rational thought. He grabbed his phone again, dialing his assistant, straight to voicemail. His jaw clenched as he tried another number, then another. No one picked up. It wasn't just the storm that had cut him off. It was something deeper, something far worse. The realization hit him like a blow. He was truly alone. The people who once circled around him, begging for his attention, had all disappeared. Frustrated, he pulled open the contact list on his phone. As he scrolled, he recognized names, former employees, ex-lovers, estranged friends, the people he had dismissed, betrayed, or simply ignored in his relentless pursuit of power. For years, he had justified his actions as necessary sacrifices. Now, looking at the names, a pang of guilt clawed at his chest, though he quickly shoved it aside. "Why should I care?" he muttered, gripping his glass of wine. "They needed me. They're the ones who left." But the mansion seemed to disagree. The walls groaned softly, as if alive, as the storm outside battered the structure. The chandelier above him swayed slightly, casting strange, flickering shadows across the room. Victor swallowed hard and forced himself to focus. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, an old business partner. Once a close friend. The phone rang and rang. Finally, someone answered. "What do you want, Victor?" The voice on the other end was cold, bitter. Victor hesitated, caught off guard by the hostility. I need to talk. Something strange is happening and..." "Strange? You're calling me about strange?" "After what you did to me, do you even remember?" The man's voice grew louder, cutting through Victor's excuse. "You ruined my life, Victor. Merry Christmas. Don't call again." The line went dead. Victor lowered the phone slowly, his heart pounding. Memories of their last conversation surfaced. The betrayal. The lies he had told. It had seemed justified at the time. Business was business after all. But now the echoes of his choices felt like daggers in his chest. Desperate, he tried another number, this time an ex-girlfriend. She didn't answer, but her voicemail told him everything he needed to know. "Hi, you've reached Linda. If this is Victor, lose my number forever." Victor flung the phone across the room. It clattered to the ground, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. He buried his face in his hands, trying to think. There had to be someone, anyone, who would speak to him, someone who hadn't turned their back on him. A knock echoed through the mansion. Victor froze. It was soft but distinct, cutting through the storm and the oppressive quiet of the house. He turned toward the sound, his breath caught in his throat. The knock came again, this time louder. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice wavering. No response. Summoning his courage, Victor grabbed the fireplace poker again and moved cautiously toward the front door. His footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls, each one louder than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver through his palm. The knock came again, harder this time, almost impatient. Victor yanked the door open. Nothing. The storm raged outside, whipping snow into his face. He scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, but there was no one there, just the howling wind and the endless night. Then he looked down. At his feet lay another note, identical to the first. He picked it up with shaking hands, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The note read, "Your reckoning has only begun." Victor stumbled back, slamming the door shut. The room spun as fear and confusion overwhelmed him. He staggered to a chair and collapsed into it. He clutching the note tightly, his mind raced, searching for answers. Who was doing this? How? And why now? The house creaked again, louder this time, as if it were alive and watching him. Victor felt the walls closing in. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, isolating himself from the world. Now that fortress felt like a prison, and he was the only prisoner. Victor Montero sat paralyzed in his chair, the second note trembling in his hands. The words, "Your reckoning has only begun," seemed to pulse on the paper, as if alive. The oppressive silence of the mansion pressed down on him, heavier than ever. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows and doors, but it was the unnatural stillness within that made his skin crawl. His chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths. "This is madness," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Someone's playing tricks on me. That's all this is." But even as he tried to convince himself, the weight in the air told a different story. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift ever so slightly, dancing to the flicker of unseen flames. The chandelier above swayed again, though there was no draft. Something was here, and Victor could feel it in his bones. Then a voice, low, deliberate and echoing as if it came from the very walls of the mansion. "Victor Montero!" Victor leaped from his chair, the note falling from his hands. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. He clutched the fireplace poker like a lifeline, his knuckles turning white. "Show yourself!" The voice did not respond. Instead, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath misted in the air as the fire in the hearth roared to life on its own, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. One shadow, darker and denser than the others, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out from the corner of the room, taking form as it approached. Victor stumbled backward, his legs weak. Before him stood a figure, semi-transparent, its edges flickering like smoke caught in a draught. The figure wore the attire of a laborer from another time. Worn boots, a patched jacket, and gloves that looked as if they had seen decades of work. Its face was pale, spectral, but unmistakably human. What are you?" Victor stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, regarding him with eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. "I am the echo of your past," it said, its voice resonating with a strange, hollow timbre. "A fragment of what you once were." Victor shook his head violently, refusing to accept what was in front of him. "You're not real. This is a hallucination. I must have drunk too much." The figure raised a hand, silencing him. "You can deny me all you want, Victor, but you cannot escape me. I am here to show you the truth." "The truth?" Victor barked a nervous laugh. "The truth about what? My success? My wealth? I've built an empire with my own hands." "An empire of broken lives," the figure interrupted, its tone cutting through Victor's bravado like a blade. "Come, Victor, let me show you." Before Victor could protest, the room began to change. The walls dissolved into mist, the furniture faded, and suddenly he was no longer in his study. He stood in a small, dimly lit workshop, the air thick with the smell of grease and metal shavings. The sound of hammers and saws filled his ears, and the faint glow of a single bulb illuminated the figure of a young man bent over a workbench. Victor's breath caught in his throat. It was him, decades younger, with worn hands and a determined expression, working tirelessly in the dead of night. This is my father's workshop," Victor whispered, his voice trembling. The ghostly figure nodded. "Indeed. Do you remember this night, Victor?" Victor did remember. How could he not? It was the night he had made a choice that would shape his entire life. He had stayed up until dawn, perfecting a prototype, determined to present it to a local investor. It was his ticket out of poverty, his chance to escape the life of back-breaking labor his father had endured. But the memory was not as perfect as he had always told himself. As he watched his younger self, Victor noticed something he had long suppressed. His father had entered the workshop, tired and worn from his own shift at the factory, pleading with him to reconsider. "You're chasing shadows, Victor," his father had said. "All this ambition will consume you. There are more important things in life than money." Victor had ignored him. Worse, he had lashed out, accusing his father of being weak, of lacking vision. The words now echoed in his ears, sharp and cruel. "Stop it," Victor muttered, clenching his fists. "I don't need to see this." The ghost's voice was calm but firm. "You must. This is where it began, Victor, the seed of your obsession." The scene dissolved, and Victor was back in the mansion, trembling. The ghost stood before him, silent and watchful. Victor sank into a chair, his face pale. "Why are you showing me this?" he demanded, his voice barely audible. "To remind you of who you were," the ghost replied, "and of what you've lost." The room fell silent, the fire dying back to embers. Victor closed his eyes, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. He had told himself for years that his ambition had been noble, necessary. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had it been worth the cost? The ghost began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows. But as it disappeared, its voice lingered in the air. "This is only the beginning." Victor opened his eyes to an empty room, his breath shaky and uneven. He was alone again, but the chill in the air and the echoes of the ghost's words told him he would not be alone for long. Victor Montero sat frozen in his chair, the ghost's final words lingering in the air like a haunting melody. "This is only the beginning." The fire in the hearth had dimmed to mere embers, but the chill in the room remained, sinking into his very bones. He clutched the arms of the chair, bracing himself for whatever was to come next. The mansion's silence stretched out again. Heavy and suffocating, Victor's mind raced. He had spent his life dismissing the past as irrelevant, burying memories he deemed unnecessary. But now, those ghosts seemed determined to unearth everything he had so carefully hidden. As he sat there, the air around him grew thick, as if the very fabric of the room was shifting. A faint, melodic humming began to fill the space, rising and falling like a lullaby. Victor turned his head sharply, searching for the source. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice betraying his fear. The humming grew louder, and suddenly the chandelier above him sparkled to life, its light brighter than ever before. The flames in the fireplace roared back, casting the room in a golden glow. Out of the corner of his eye, Victor noticed movement, a figure stepping into view from the far end of the room. This figure was different from the last, dressed in an elegant emerald gown, adorned with shimmering gold accents. The woman radiated a warmth that was almost disarming. Her hair, dark and flowing, framed a face both kind and piercing. She carried a lantern in one hand, its light spilling in soft waves across the floor. Victor stood, though his legs felt weak beneath him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a mix of suspicion and wonder. I am the spirit of the present, the woman said, her voice calm yet commanding. I am here to show you the life you've chosen to ignore. Victor frowned, his grip tightening on the chair. I've ignored nothing. I know my life better than anyone. The spirit smiled gently, though there was sadness in her eyes. Do you? Come, Victor, let me show you what you cannot see. Before he could respond, the room transformed around him. The walls dissolved, the furniture disappeared, and Victor found himself standing on a busy street corner. Snow fell gently, coating the sidewalks and rooftops in a pristine white. He recognized the place immediately. It was a neighborhood where several of his former employees lived. The scene was bustling with activity. Families carried bags of groceries, children laughed and threw snowballs, and small groups of neighbors exchanged warm holiday greetings. It was a picture-perfect Christmas scene. But Victor's gaze was drawn to a particular house. The spirit gestured toward it. Look closely, Victor. Through the frosted windows, Victor saw a man sitting at a modest dining table. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes sparkled with a quiet determination. Around him sat his wife and 2 young children, their laughter filling the room. A single, simple meal sat on the table, a far cry from the feasts Victor was accustomed to. Victor's breath hitched. He recognized the man instantly. It was one of his former factory workers, a man he had fired years ago for speaking out against wage cuts. I know him, Victor murmured, stepping closer. He used to work for me. Yes, the spirit said, her tone soft but firm. And now he struggles to provide for his family because of choices you made. Victor bristled. He was insubordinate. I had every right to let him go. The spirit turned to face him, her eyes piercing. Did you, Victor, or was it easier to see him as expendable than to address his concerns? Victor opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He watched as the man pulled a small gift from behind his chair, a hand-carved wooden toy. The children squealed with delight as they unwrapped it, their joy lighting up the room. They're happy, Victor said defensively. They're managing. They are, the spirit agreed, but not because of you. Their happiness exists in spite of your actions, not because of them. The scene shifted again, the snow dissolving into the dim glow of a cramped apartment. Victor blinked, disoriented, as the spirit led him inside. This time, he saw a woman sitting alone at a small table. A single candle flickered beside her, casting long shadows on the walls. Victor's chest tightened. It was Linda, his former lover. She's still here, he whispered, his voice heavy with guilt. Yes, the spirit replied, though you left her with nothing but broken promises. Victor watched as Linda poured herself a glass of wine, her expression distant. She glanced at an old photo on the table, a picture of the 2 of them, smiling in happier times. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, tears glistening in her eyes. I told her I wasn't ready for commitment, Victor said, his voice barely audible. I didn't lie to her. No, the spirit said, but you let her believe you cared more than you truly did. And when you walked away, you left her to rebuild her life alone. Victor turned away, unable to bear the sight. Why are you showing me this? He demanded. What good will it do to dredge up these memories? To show you the ripple effect of your choices, the spirit replied. And to remind you that while you sit alone in your mansion, others carry the weight of the decisions you've made. Victor's hands clenched into fists. I've done what I needed to do to succeed. That's the cost of ambition. The spirit stepped closer, her expression unreadable. Perhaps, but tonight you must ask yourself, what have you gained and what have you lost? Before Victor could respond, The scene began to dissolve once more. The apartment faded. The snow vanished, and he found himself back in his mansion, standing before the spirit. "You have one more visitor tonight, Victor," she said, her voice softer now, "and they will show you what lies ahead." The chandelier dimmed, the fire in the hearth flickered, and the spirit began to fade. "Wait!" Victor called out, his voice trembling. "What am I supposed to do with all of this? What am I supposed to change?" The spirit's final words echoed in the room as she disappeared. "That is for you to decide." Victor stood alone once more, his breath heavy, his mind racing. He sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. And deep down, he knew the night was far from over. Victor Montero sat in the heavy silence of his mansion, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the chill that had settled into his bones. He clutched the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. His mind replayed the scenes he had just witnessed: the struggling worker, the solitary woman, the undeniable impact of his choices. For the first time in years, doubt gnawed at him. The clock struck 3, and the sound reverberated through the mansion like a distant funeral bell. Victor straightened in his chair, every nerve on edge. He expected the air to shift, the shadows to grow, some signal of the next visitor. But nothing happened. The room remained still. Then a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging it into darkness. Victor stood, his heart racing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. From the far corner of the room, a figure emerged, tall and cloaked in shadows. Its form was indistinct, wrapped in a heavy black robe that concealed everything but its presence. The figure moved without sound, its very existence commanding silence and dread. Victor stepped back, his legs weak beneath him. "You must be the last one," he said, forcing bravado into his voice, "the ghost of Christmas yet to come." The figure said nothing. It raised a single skeletal hand, pointing toward the door. Victor hesitated, his mouth dry. "What do you want to show me?" he whispered. The ghost remained silent, its gesture unwavering. Victor felt a cold dread seep into his chest, but he forced his legs to move. Step by step, he followed the ghost out of the room, down the grand staircase, and into the swirling mist that had somehow replaced the familiar halls of his home. Victor found himself standing in the heart of the city. But it was different. The streets, usually bustling with life, were eerily quiet. Snow fell softly, but it did nothing to soften the oppressive atmosphere. The ghost led him forward, weaving through the shadows, until they stopped outside a building Victor recognized as one of his former offices. The windows were dark, the once proud company logo now faded and cracked. Victor frowned. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "That building was thriving." The ghost pointed again, this time toward a group of people huddled on the steps of the building. Their clothes were worn, their faces lined with exhaustion. Victor recognized some of them. They were former employees, people he had laid off during a particularly harsh round of budget cuts. As he watched, one of them spoke. "He didn't care," the man said bitterly, his voice carrying on the wind. "Montero only looked out for himself, and look where it got him." The others nodded, their expressions dark. "Serves him right," another added. "No one even showed up to his funeral." Victor's stomach turned. "My funeral?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What are they talking about?" The ghost didn't respond. It merely turned and began walking again. Victor followed, his heart pounding. The scene shifted again. Now Victor stood in a cemetery, the air cold and heavy. Rows of tombstones stretched out before him, their surfaces slick with ice. The ghost led him to a fresh grave, the earth still unsettled. A simple, unadorned marker stood at its head. Victor's hands trembled as he stepped closer. He knelt, brushing snow away from the marker to reveal the inscription, Victor Montero, forgotten in death as he was in life. "No," Victor whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be. I'm Victor Montero. People respect me. I've built nothing," a voice echoed, though the ghost remained silent. It seemed to come from the grave itself, cold and final. "You've built nothing that lasts." Victor fell to his knees, his chest heaving. "I can change," he cried. "This doesn't have to happen. Tell me this isn't set in stone." The ghost remained motionless, its skeletal hand pointing downward, as if sealing Victor's fate. The ground beneath Victor began to crumble. He tried to scramble back, but it was no use. The earth opened beneath him, pulling him into the darkness. He screamed, reaching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the void. Suddenly, Victor jolted awake. He was back in his chair, his study illuminated by the soft glow of dawn. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his body drenched in sweat. The ghost was gone, and the mansion was silent once more. Victor sat there, shaking as the realization washed over him. He still had time. Time to change, time to undo the damage he had caused. But he knew the clock was ticking, and this was his last chance. Victor Montero sat motionless in his chair, the faint morning light creeping through the curtains. His heart pounded in his chest as if trying to break free, his mind racing with the visions he had just endured. The silence of the mansion was deafening now, no longer comforting but suffocating. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around, half expecting another spirit to appear. But there was nothing. Only the echoes of the words and images burned into his memory. For the first time in years, Victor felt something unfamiliar. Hope, a chance to change. To rewrite the ending he had seen, to avoid the grave that bore his name and the bitter words of those he had wronged. His hands trembled as he stood, unsteady but determined. The mansion, though quiet, seemed different. The cold, oppressive air had lifted slightly, replaced by a faint warmth that Victor hadn't noticed before. He moved toward the window and pulled back the heavy drapes. The storm had passed, leaving the city bathed in the soft glow of morning. Snow blanketed the streets, and distant church bells rang, marking Christmas Day. Victor stared out at the scene, his chest tightening. For so long he had dismissed Christmas as a triviality, a nuisance. But now he saw it for what it was, a symbol of redemption, of connection, of hope. He closed his eyes and made a silent vow. "I'll make it right," he whispered. "I'll make it all right." Victor's first act of the day was to call his staff. For years, he had treated them as little more than cogs in his machine, dismissing their humanity in favor of efficiency. He had no illusions that a single day of generosity could undo a lifetime of coldness, but it was a start. He dialed the number for his former assistant, Emily, a woman he had fired without cause years ago. When her voice answered, tentative and unsure, Victor felt a lump rise in his throat. "Emily, it's Victor Montero," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. There was a long pause. "Victor, why are you calling me?" "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "about the mistakes I've made, about the way I've treated people. I want to make things right." Emily's silence was palpable. Finally, she spoke, her tone cautious. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't have time for this." "It's not a game," Victor said quickly. "Please let me prove it to you. Come to the mansion. Bring your family. There's something I need to do, and I want you to be part of it." There was another pause. And then Emily sighed. "Fine. But if this is some kind of trick, Victor, I swear, it's not, he assured her. Thank you. Victor spent the next few hours in a whirlwind of activity. He called a caterer, ensuring that enough food would be delivered to feed dozens of people. He arranged for decorations to be brought in, filling the mansion with warmth and light for the first time in years. Most importantly, he contacted every former employee, every estranged friend, and every person he had pushed away over the years. One by one, they responded, some with skepticism, others with cautious curiosity. But Victor didn't care. He was determined to bring them all together, to show them the man he was becoming. By the time the first guests arrived, the mansion was unrecognizable. The cold, empty halls were filled with the sound of laughter and music. The dining room, once a stark symbol of Victor's isolation, was now a vibrant space adorned with garlands, candles, and a massive feast. As the room filled with familiar faces, Victor felt a nervous energy building in his chest. He saw Emily standing by the fireplace with her family, her arms crossed as she studied him warily. Across the room, he spotted the factory worker he had seen in the vision of the present, his children clutching handmade toys that Victor had ensured were delivered earlier that morning. Even Linda had come, standing near the doorway with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and hesitation. Victor stepped to the center of the room, clearing his throat. The conversations died down, and all eyes turned to him. "I know what you're all thinking," he began, his voice steady but raw. "Why would someone like me do this? Why now? And I don't blame you for questioning it. For years I've been selfish. I've hurt people. I've made choices that were easier for me and devastating for others. And for that, I am deeply sorry." The room was silent. Victor's hands trembled as he continued. "Last night, I was given a gift, a chance to see what my life has truly become. I saw the pain I've caused, the people I've abandoned, and I saw what my future would look like if I didn't change. It wasn't just lonely. It was meaningless." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But today I'm here to start over, to make amends, to be better. I know it won't be easy, and I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm asking for your forgiveness and your trust. Let me show you that I can change." For a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. Victor turned to see Emily, her stern expression softening into a small, genuine smile. The applause grew, spreading through the room until it was thunderous. Victor felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of connection, of belonging. Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and hope. Victor moved from person to person, listening to their stories, their frustrations, their dreams. He didn't try to defend his past actions. He simply listened and promised to do better. As the evening wound down, Linda approached him. She held the old photograph he had seen in the vision, her fingers tracing its edges. "You've changed, Victor," she said softly. "I can see it, but it'll take more than one Christmas to fix everything." Victor nodded, his voice steady. "I know, but I'm ready to try." She smiled, slipping the photo back into her bag. "Then I'll be here to see it." That night, as the last guest left and the mansion fell quiet once more, Victor stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. For the first time, he didn't feel the cold weight of loneliness. He felt hope. Redemption was not a gift he had expected to receive. But now that he had it, he vowed never to waste it. The clock struck midnight, marking the end of Christmas Day. But for Victor Montero, it was only the beginning. Victor Montero awoke the morning after Christmas with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. The memories of the night before still lingered. vivid and raw, but now they carried something more, a glimmer of hope. The mansion, though still vast and quiet, no longer felt like a tomb. For the first time in years, it felt like a place where something meaningful could begin. Standing by the window, Victor watched the city stir to life beneath a blanket of snow. He sipped his coffee slowly, his mind racing with plans. Last night's gathering had been just the start. There was still so much to do, so many people to reach out to. He thought of Emily's hesitant smile, of Linda's quiet words of encouragement, and of the factory workers' children clutching their small wooden toys. Each memory fueled his resolve. Victor's first call of the day was to his legal team. "I want to review every contract, every deal we've made over the past decade," he told them, his voice firm. "And I want to identify every policy or practice that's harmed our employees or the communities we operate in." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Finally, one of his lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Montero, are you suggesting we voluntarily revisit and possibly undo decisions that have been highly profitable for the company?" "Yes," Victor said without hesitation. "And while you're at it, I want to establish a fund for the employees we've wronged. Back pay, medical coverage, housing assistance, whatever they need, make it happen." The lawyer hesitated again. "This will cost millions, sir." Victor leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "Then it's about time I start spending it on something that matters." Later that day, Victor walked through the doors of one of his factories, a place he hadn't set foot in since its opening. The workers stopped what they were doing, their eyes widening in disbelief. Victor Montero, the elusive billionaire, was standing among them. He raised a hand, signaling for their attention. "I know you're probably wondering why I'm here," he began, his voice steady. "And the truth is, I should have come a long time ago." The room was silent, the workers exchanging uncertain glances. "For years, I've made decisions from the comfort of my office without ever truly understanding the impact they had on all of you. Last night I realized how wrong I've been." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I'm here to change that, starting today. We're implementing new policies to ensure fair wages, better working conditions, and proper benefits for everyone." Murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. Victor held up his hands. "I know it'll take time for me to earn your trust, and I won't blame you if you're skeptical. But I promise you this, I'm committed to making things right." As the days turned into weeks, Victor's transformation became impossible to ignore. He visited his offices, factories, and warehouses, listening to employees, taking notes, and implementing changes. He worked tirelessly to repair relationships with former friends and partners, many of whom were initially reluctant to believe in his newfound sincerity. One afternoon, he met with the man he had seen in the spirit's vision, the former factory worker who had struggled to provide for his family. Victor arrived at the man's modest home unannounced, carrying a folder of documents. "I've been working on something for you," Victor said, handing the folder over. The man opened it, his eyes widening as he read. It contained a letter formally reinstating his position, along with compensation for the years he had been unemployed. This can't be real," the man stammered, looking up at Victor. "It is," Victor said, his voice earnest. "I owe you and your family more than I can ever repay. This is just the beginning." The man's wife appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of shock and gratitude. Their children peeked out from behind her, their curious eyes fixed on Victor. "Thank you," the man said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Victor shook his hand firmly. "No, thank you for giving me a chance to make amends." Despite his progress, Victor knew not everyone was ready to forgive him. Linda, in particular, remained guarded. They had met several times since Christmas. Each conversation, a tentative step toward rebuilding trust. One evening, Victor invited her to dinner at a small restaurant, far from the grandeur of his usual haunts. As they sat across from each other, he spoke openly about his regrets and his hopes for the future. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice heavy. "But I can try to be a better man moving forward. I want you to be part of that journey, if you're willing." Linda studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "You've made a good start, Victor, but I'll be watching to see if you keep it up." Victor smiled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "That's fair, and I'll make sure you don't regret it." By the end of January, Victor's efforts had begun to bear fruit. Employees reported higher morale, former partners reached out to collaborate again, and the community began to see him not as a cold and ruthless businessman, but as someone striving to make a difference. One snowy evening, as Victor stood on the steps of his mansion, he looked out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. He still had a long way to go, but the journey itself filled him with purpose. The man he had once been was gone, buried in the past where he belonged. In his place stood someone new, someone who understood the value of connection, of compassion, of redemption. And this time, Victor Montero was determined to get it right. Victor Montero's newfound purpose was a beacon of light in his life. But the path he walked was far from smooth. By February, his efforts to rebuild relationships and right his wrongs had garnered attention, not all of it positive. Old rivals and former allies who had once thrived on his cold, business-driven persona began to see his transformation as a threat. "You're alienating the board, Victor," one of his top executives, Martin Hayes, said during a tense meeting at Montero Industries. The boardroom was unusually quiet, the faces of the other executives a mixture of concern and skepticism. Victor leaned forward, meeting Martin's gaze with steady resolve. "I'm not alienating anyone. I'm doing what's right for the company and its people." Martin shook his head. "What you're doing is jeopardizing everything we've built. You've already approved pay raises and benefits that cut into our profits. Now you're talking about reinvesting in local communities instead of focusing on global expansion. Shareholders won't stand for it." Victor exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance, but it still stung. If the shareholders don't want to stand for doing the right thing, then maybe they're not the kind of people I want supporting this company. A murmur rippled through the room. Martin's jaw tightened. "You're being reckless, Victor. One mistake and this company will crumble." Victor stood, his voice calm but commanding. "Then let it crumble, Martin. Because if it's built on the backs of exploited workers and broken promises, it doesn't deserve to stand." The room fell silent. Victor gathered his papers and left the meeting. His heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. That night, Victor returned to his mansion, feeling the weight of the day's battles. As he walked through the grand halls, he couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough, or if his efforts would ultimately be in vain. The thought lingered in his mind as he poured himself a glass of water and stared into the quiet void of the house. A knock at the door startled him. It was late, far past the hour when anyone might casually visit. His brow furrowed as he set down the glass and made his way to the front door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find a young woman standing on the steps, bundled in a coat too thin for the icy night. "Mr. Montero?" she asked, her voice hesitant but steady. "Yes," Victor replied. "Can I help you?" She took a deep breath. "My name is Elena. You don't know me, but my father used to work in one of your factories." Victor's heart sank. He had met so many people in recent weeks, heard so many stories of those he had wronged. But this felt different. "Come inside," he said gently, stepping aside to let her in. Seated in the warmth of the study, Elena shared her story. Her father, Miguel, had been a loyal worker at one of Victor's factories for over a decade. But during a round of layoffs years ago, he had been let go without warning. Struggling to find work and provide for his family, Miguel had fallen into despair, eventually succumbing to illness. "He blamed himself," Elena said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But it wasn't his fault. He gave everything to that job. And when it was taken from him, he didn't know how to move on." Victor felt a lump rise in his throat. "Elena, I can't undo what happened to your father, but I can help your family now. Please, tell me what you need." Elena shook her head. "I didn't come here for money, Mr. Montero. I came here to ask you to keep going, to keep helping people like my father. You've started something important, and I don't want anyone else to suffer the way we did." Victor was stunned. He had expected anger, accusations, even rejection. But instead, this young woman had come to encourage him, to remind him why he had chosen this path in the first place. "I promise you," Victor said, his voice firm, "I won't stop. Not until I've done everything I can to make this right." Elena nodded, a faint smile breaking through her grief. "Thank you." The encounter with Elena reignited Victor's determination, but it also served as a reminder of how much work lay ahead. Over the following weeks, he doubled down on his efforts, launching new initiatives to support not just his employees, but their families and communities as well. However, the resistance he faced grew stronger. News outlets began to criticize his choices, labeling him a bleeding heart, unfit to run a major corporation. His rivals seized the opportunity to spread doubt among investors, and whispers of a hostile takeover began to circulate. Victor knew he was walking a tightrope. But instead of retreating, he pressed forward, determined to prove that doing the right thing wasn't just good for people. It was good for business. One day, as Victor walked through a renovated factory floor, he was approached by a man in his 60s, his face weathered but kind. "Mr. Montero," the man said, extending his hand. "I've worked here since the beginning. I've seen this place change a lot over the years, and I have to say, I wasn't sure what to think when you started making all these changes. But now I see the difference. You're making this a place worth working at again." Victor shook the man's hand, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know." As the weeks turned into months, Victor's transformation continued to ripple outward. His company, once a symbol of ruthless ambition, became a model for ethical practices and corporate responsibility. And though the road was far from easy, Victor faced each challenge with the same unwavering resolve that had carried him through the night of the spirits. For the first time in his life, Victor Montero felt truly alive. Not because of his wealth, but because of the connections he was building, the lives he was improving, and the legacy he was creating. But he knew there was still one final step to take. Victor Montero stood in the center of his office, staring out the massive windows that overlooked the bustling city. It had been nearly a year since his fateful Christmas Eve, and the man he saw reflected in the glass was unrecognizable from the cold, isolated figure he had once been. The corporate empire he had built was no longer a fortress of greed, but a thriving hub of innovation, compassion, and community. But there was one person Victor had yet to face. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk where a single envelope lay waiting. Inside was a letter he had written weeks ago but hadn't had the courage to send. It was addressed to a man whose life had been intertwined with his in ways that Victor had long tried to forget. His younger brother, Gabriel. The estrangement between the two brothers had been one of Victor's earliest and deepest failures. Gabriel had always been the heart of their family, full of warmth and generosity, while Victor, even as a young man, had been driven by ambition. When their parents passed away, Victor had inherited the family business, and Gabriel had expected them to work together to carry on their legacy, but Victor had other plans. Seeing his brother's idealism as a liability, he had forced Gabriel out, offering him a small buyout that severed their ties. Gabriel, heartbroken and betrayed, had left without a word, disappearing from Victor's life. Now, as Victor stared at the letter in his hands, the weight of that decision pressed heavily on his chest. The spirits had shown him the consequences of his actions on so many lives, but none of them stung as much as the thought of his own brother's pain. With a deep breath, Victor picked up the phone and dialed the number he had tracked down weeks ago. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a voice answered. "Hello?" Victor's throat tightened. "Gabriel, it's Victor." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Gabriel finally spoke, his voice was cautious. "What do you want, Victor?" Victor closed his eyes, steadying himself. "I want to see you, to talk. There's so much I need to say. And I don't know if I'll ever get another chance." Gabriel sighed. "It's been over 20 years. Why now?" "Because I'm not the same man I was," Victor said, his voice raw with emotion. "And I don't want to waste another moment pretending that what I did to you was anything less than unforgivable. Please, Gabriel, just give me a chance." After a long pause, Gabriel relented. "All right, tomorrow noon. There's a diner on 4th Street. We'll talk." The next day, Victor arrived at the diner early, his nerves frayed. The simple, cozy atmosphere was a stark contrast to the high-end restaurants he was used to. But he found it comforting. He chose a booth near the window and ordered a coffee, his mind racing with what he would say. When the door jingled open, Victor looked up to see Gabriel stepping inside. His brother looked older, his hair streaked with gray, but his presence was unmistakable. Gabriel's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Victor. With measured steps, he walked over and slid into the booth across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with decades of unspoken words. "Thank you for coming," Victor said finally, his voice quiet. Gabriel shrugged. "Curiosity got the better of me. What do you want to say?" Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I've spent the last year trying to make up for the things I've done, the people I've hurt, the bridges I've burned. But out of everyone, the one person I've wronged the most is sitting right in front of me." Gabriel's expression softened slightly, but he remained guarded. "Go on." Victor took a deep breath. "What I did to you was cruel and selfish. I took something that wasn't mine to take, our parents' legacy, your trust, and I destroyed it for my own gain. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was blinded by my ambition. And I'm so sorry, Gabriel, for all of it." Gabriel's eyes searched Victor's face, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "You think saying sorry fixes 20 years of silence?" "No," Victor admitted. "I don't, but it's the only place I can start." The brothers sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "I've spent years hating you," he said, his voice low. "I built a life without you because I didn't think I had a choice. But hearing you say this now, it helps. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, but I'm willing to try." Victor's shoulders sagged with relief. "That's more than I deserve." Gabriel offered a faint smile. "Maybe. But people change. Maybe you have too." The two brothers spent hours in that diner, talking and reconnecting. By the time they parted ways, Victor felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. For the first time, He truly believed that redemption was possible, not just for him, but for the relationships he had thought were beyond repair. Back at his mansion that evening, Victor sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the day. The road ahead would still be difficult, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time, he felt a deep, unshakable peace. He had faced the hardest parts of himself and emerged stronger, more human. Victor Montero was no longer the man who had once been abandoned on Christmas Eve. He was someone new, someone who understood the true meaning of connection, compassion, and redemption, and this, he realized, was only the beginning. A year after that fateful Christmas Eve, Victor Montero stood in the heart of a bustling community center, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and a renewed sense of purpose. The room was alive with activity, children playing, families sharing meals, and workers discussing new opportunities. It was a far cry from the cold, silent mansion where his journey had begun. Victor had poured his resources into building this center, a place where those who had once been left behind by his ambition could now thrive. It was more than a gesture of goodwill. It was a symbol of his transformation and a tangible step toward making amends. As he moved through the crowd, Victor spotted familiar faces. Emily, who had rejoined his company and now managed its charitable initiatives. Linda, who was helping to coordinate a fundraiser in one corner of the room, and Gabriel, standing near the entrance, a smile on his face as he watched his brother interact with the people they had once been so far removed from. Victor approached Gabriel, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice warm. Gabriel shrugged, though there was a glint of humor in his eyes. "It's not every day I get to see my brother play the hero." Victor chuckled, but his tone grew serious. "I'm no hero, Gabriel. I'm just a man trying to fix what he broke." Gabriel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than that. This," he gestured to the bustling room around them, "this is what Dad would have wanted." Victor's chest tightened at the mention of their father. But it wasn't the familiar sting of regret. It was pride. For the first time, he felt he was honoring the man who had taught him the value of hard work, integrity, and family. As the evening progressed, Victor found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the room where a young boy sat alone, clutching a wooden toy. The toy was simple but beautifully crafted, and Victor recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one he had seen in his vision of the present. Kneeling down, he smiled at the boy. "That's a fine toy you've got there. Did you make it?" The boy shook his head, his eyes wide. "My dad did. He said you helped him get a job so he could buy the tools to make it." Victor's heart swelled. "Your dad sounds like a great man." The boy nodded, his face lighting up. "He is. He said you're not so bad either." Victor laughed softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "I'm trying, kid. I'm trying." The night wound down, and as the guests began to leave, Victor stood by the entrance, shaking hands and exchanging warm farewells. For each person who thanked him, he offered the same reply: "You don't owe me thanks. I owe you everything." As the last of the crowd trickled out, Victor found himself alone in the now quiet room. He looked around, taking in the decorations, the lingering warmth, the echoes of laughter that still seemed to hang in the air. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The door creaked open, and Linda stepped inside, her coat draped over one arm. "Still here?" she asked, her tone teasing. Victor smiled, just taking it all in. She walked over, standing beside him. "You've done something incredible here, Victor." He shook his head. "We've done something incredible. None of this would have been possible without people like you." Linda tilted her head, studying him. "You've really changed, haven't you?" Victor met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I had to. I didn't have a choice if I wanted to live a life that mattered." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well, I think you've earned a second chance." Victor felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't with regret or fear. It was hope, a deep, abiding hope that he had spent years chasing in all the wrong places. As Victor walked Linda to her car, the snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, quiet peace. He stood in the driveway, watching the flakes dance in the air, his breath misting in the cold night. For years, Christmas had been a reminder of everything he lacked, but now it was a celebration of everything he had gained: family, community, redemption. Victor Montero had been a man who had lost everything, not because it had been taken from him, but because he had pushed it away. Now he was a man who had regained it all, not through wealth or power, but through humility, kindness, and a willingness to change. As the snow fell around him, Victor turned back toward the community center, its lights shining brightly against the dark sky. He smiled to himself, knowing that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone he had the privilege of helping. And for the first time in his life, Victor Montero felt truly rich.